Oh, well, hello there. Um, Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're going to be talking about kinship, family, and marriage, um, and how different cultures organize their families differently, and how we can look at that and understand how different cultures might interact with each other differently based off of their kinship and sort of family structures, and why it's important for us to be able to understand those things and how we might benefit from it. Okay, so what is kinship, right? Kinship is how we determine um, who is important to us, right? So whether or not they are our family, our biological family, whether or not they are outside of our biological family. It also helps us determine rights and responsibilities to each member of our family, like what kind of um, influence do they have, what kind of relationship do they have, and what those relationships actually mean. Okay, it's how we define power within families, right? Who has that authority? Um, as a social network, it's oftentimes more has more strength than political or religious or social or economic um, uh, sort of um, uh, importance in our lives. Kinship and family are usually really important. Oftentimes because as children growing up in that family, it helps us to we want to help our parents and our grandparents. And if those political or religious ideologies um, interfere, then people have a tendency to usually focus more on their family than they do on those other things. So they will sacrifice other things to maintain family ties. And so that's important to keep in mind. Um, Again, oftentimes we have a tendency to focus on the biological aspect of kinship, um, but it oftentimes involves other people that come into our lives that end up having those sort of um, that same sort of importance as that biological family member might have. Um, we oftentimes use um, kinship to understand how other cultures sort of form, right? And if we look at kinship, we can start to see how um, a lot of ideas about value systems, economic systems, will work within a community because it might depend on, again, who has those resources. Are they shared resources? Do you have a big family unit versus a small family unit? That can definitely have a big impact compared to like um, uh, say you lost your job, right? If you lose your job and you live in a house with four generations living in that same house and maybe 20 people living in that house, the likelihood of you having sort of a catastrophic event take place because you lost your job is pretty slim because you have the resources of all those other people to help back you up, right? Versus, say you moved out of your parents' house, maybe moved to another state, and you're all on your own, and then you lose your job. That social backup, that social um, sort of uh, security net isn't there, right? So, how your kinship system works might determine what happens if you end up, um, having how you might respond to some sort of catastrophic event. And we saw a lot of this if we think about sort of the pandemic in the last few years when economics became, very difficult. People were losing their jobs, And a lot of folks were moving home to live with their parents. Not only folks in their 20s, but folks in their 20s and 30s and 40s are like, I need someplace secure, and that's oftentimes that older generation's already established. And so families would, again, start coming together, moving home, moving to different states or cities in order to find that security. So, right, and we can look at how families deal with those sort of economic um, influences, right, to help us understand how people are going to engage. And, um, if they don't have those security nets, what happens to them then, right? What happens with homelessness and stuff like that? You'll have more instances of homelessness when you have smaller family units than you will with larger family units. And that's just because of, again, access to resources. Um, so let's see. Yeah, we pretty much talked about all of those things. Descent groups. Okay. So a descent group is how a culture is going to look at its ancestors, right? In the United States, we look at our ancestors both from our mother and father sides. So we look at our grandparents on each side equally, um, for the most part equally, not entirely. And then we sort of follow that family tree, right? Oftentimes there is sort of the patrilineal, right? We follow the male lineage. That's oftentimes easier to do so because of our tradition of how a wife will often take the husband's name, right? And so if you have that lineage of name taking, then it's easier to follow. And so that matrilineal lineage isn't always as easy to follow when you're trying to trace back people because there are names that are changing. Um, so right, we follow those lineages. Um, a lot of the world today uses a patrilineal lineage system. There aren't as many matrilineal systems used, although it depends on, again, the community. There are a lot of Native American communities that were matrilineal prior to contact and also surviving colonial contact. And then we also have clans. Clans can be groups of family members that might be, and depending on your community, if I'm talking about like Native Americans, you might have a group that has like a bear clan or a turtle clan, or you might have a clan that's associated with a specific ancestor. Um, in which you might not necessarily have direct lineage, but more ideological lineage. So you might not have that biological connection. Um, and this is just a different way of looking at the world, right? Having some sort of ideology, some sort of expectations about behavior that is associated with that particular clan ideology. Um, Again, thinking about descent lineages within Native American groups, a lot of the belief is that there's matrilineal descent practices until the introduction of the horse, which led to greater warfare. Okay, the horse made it easier for people to travel farther distances quickly. And I think to sort of put this in the context and sort of what the horse did um, along with things like the rifle, it changed a lot of societies. When you had hunter-gatherer societies, you didn't have as much warfare. It isn't until you start getting access to that kind of technology, horses, guns, or sort of resource heavy communities like cities and towns, and you end up needing more resources as you encounter more growth, that you start running into more and more conflict. And so, with the introduction of the horse, there had already been a lot of conflict between Native Americans and the federal government and state governments. Um, and that got translated and pushed the further west you got. And uh, a lot of these communities adapted to warfare, specifically because of this. Um, and it changed the power structure within those families. So if you're switching over from a matrilineal system in which your community might have been hunter-gatherers, but now you've got the resources to go and take resources from another group because you have those rifles and guns, then it becomes more militaristic. And that's not necessarily to say that there weren't a lot of women that weren't engaging in military activities, those martial activities. There were, but also the fact that that it became more and more of a men's activity. So yeah, it changed the dynamics for a lot of cultures as they were adapting to new situations. Not always, but it certainly did quite a few. Uh, One of the issues that we have when we're researching kinship is sometimes putting together that historical past. Now, in lots of communities around the world, their lineage is passed on from generation to generation and is oftentimes done so through an oral tradition where you learn who your ancestors are. And we still have that, but it's not as common as it might have been. Um, we also like to keep records of folks. And in the United States, we have like a database for birth certificates, but honestly, birth certificates haven't been that popular in the United States for very long. Um, and so the recording of a birth um, was oftentimes recorded uh, in the documentation from like hospitals or very often in churches. You might have an old family Bible, and in that Bible might be a record of the folks that have been born into that family. So that might be one of those documents that ends up staying with a family, going back a number of generations. But say like in the United States, one of the issues would be that people would change their names. So, for example, my mother's maiden name. Originally it's a Swiss name, and for us we pronounce it Yale, but it's not the Y-A-L-E, it's Y-E-H-L-E. But it used to be spelled J-E-H-L-E, and when they originally came over to the United States, the spelling pronunciation didn't make sense in American English. So they dropped the J, added the Y, and just started pronouncing it Yale instead of Yaley. And so there was this shift in order to fit into American culture. Their names were changed. This can have a profound impact on tracing your lineage, right? So tracing someone's name down if they changed it. And it's not always recorded, or sometimes those records might be lost, that name change actually took place. And sometimes it was as easy as just If you came over by boat, then you were given a name. Um, when we look at, say, African American communities, name taking was, or name giving was a serious practice, um, especially when we're considering slavery, right? Excuse me. A lot of those communities that were enslaved and um, abused oftentimes had their names stripped away, right, and were given anglicized names or Christian names. Uh, and so trying to trace back within those families to their um, cultural origins can be near on impossible, right? You might be able to find some genetic um, uh, tags that allow you to trace back your genealogy that way, but a lot of that culture was destroyed. And so trying to find that information um, can be absolutely daunting to find out where you come from. And so depending on who you are, your race, your gender, your sexuality, all of those things can have an impact on naming practices and um, how those names are maintained and recorded for posterity for us to be able to go back and do research on. Um, so thinking about that missing information, those gaps in the records, um, right? Who's recording that information? Again, oftentimes it was churches. We don't see widespread literacy until, for the most part, this last century. Prior to that, literacy was not all that important. And so if you weren't literate, it's hard to record um, stuff about your family. You'd tell your kids and your grandkids and your great grandkids about the legacy, but one of the issues is sort of generational memory. If you can't remember, or if you um, have kids, but they aren't going to remember everything that you know, and eventually some of that information, if not all of that information, might be lost. So that can happen within a number of generations. And we see the same sort of sort of loss of information when we think about boarding schools here in the United States, especially with Native Americans. If they were forced to go to those boarding schools, then that their language, their traditions, were lost. And a lot of that can also, have that generational memory of who they were, who their ancestors are. So, in anthropology, we're going to focus on 6 different kinship systems. The Eskimo, the Hawaiian, the Sudanese, the Omaha, the Crow, and the Iroquois. Each one of these systems reacts differently um, uh, to each household, right? They have different rights and responsibilities. Every member in it is going to be different. If we look at the Eskimo system, and this is the one that is most common throughout North America and Europe, this is sort of our standard nuclear family, right? You have your parents, mother and father, and they have their grandparents. Um, and so you have those distinct lineages, and then you're going to have your um, say your aunts and uncles. Okay, so your dad has a brother and a sister, and then say they get married, and then they have kids, and then those kids become your cousins. Okay, that's pretty standard, right? And then we look at how those cousins are sort of organized. If they're the kids of your mother's or father's brother or sister, then they're those first cousins, right? Um, if they're second cousins, so like your parents' first cousins, those become your second cousins. And so you can see that there might be this big branching out of a family. So this is how we experience our family, right? This is how we oftentimes see it um, in the West. Now, if we look at Hawaiian um, relationships, this goes a little bit different, right? So if we're looking at here, we've got your father, your mother. Here's yourself. Say you've got a brother or a sister. Um, but then we look at our parents' lineage, right? So our parents, so your mom, right, might have a brother and sister. Well, they're your aunt and uncle, right? Here's your aunt, here's your uncle, but their rights and responsibilities actually match your parents, right? So you would actually treat them and they would treat you like a parental relationship, right? They have the rights and responsibilities for living and organizing and helping within that community. So you might have multiple parents. Say your mom and your dad have a lot of brothers and sisters. Well, that means that all of those resources, right, and are going to be shared, and that your parents, right, if you've got those first cousins, right, they're not actually cousins, they're your brothers and sisters, right? Even though they might not be genetically your brothers and sisters, they're your cousins coming from, our point of view. They have the same rights and responsibilities as a brother or sister would have. Now, think about the impact that that might have on a household, right? Oftentimes, if we look at Hawaiian sort of family organizations, they were oftentimes living in long houses, right? Where you might have 4 generations, you might have 20 people living under the same roof, right? And it creates this social network system that allows everyone to organize and work together. And it changes our perception of what is important, right? We don't have those cousins or aunts and uncles. They don't have less responsibility. They have the same responsibility as your parents and siblings will have. Um, and we see this through the biological lens, right? One of the things that we'll point out here, say on your father's side, your uncle, his brother, who you would consider to be one of your fathers, gets married. Well, that woman doesn't have um, the same rights and responsibilities. In fact, she's sort of on the outside, right? Not that she won't have a big impact in the family as well, but she might not have the same sort of decision making that your parents are going to have, or your blood relatives are going to have. So this is optimizing for blood relatives coming in and having an actual say within the family's organization, right? And the same can be said for your father's sister, right? Also considered a mother. Her husband would not have those same um, rights, which means that the sort of gendered authority within that family um, might be a little bit more um, equal when it comes to raising kids and how those families are going to be sort of organized. Okay, then we've got Sudanese. The Sudanese is almost the exact opposite. Okay, here's your mother and your parents. This is yourself, but now you've got sister and brother, and depending on order of birth, they're gonna be having different responsibilities, right? Firstborn versus lastborn are going to have different rights, different um, again, responsibilities within the family, and that can be changed as far as like resources are concerned, right? Then you can look again at this hierarchical difference between aunts and uncles. Your aunts and uncles are going to have a specific place within that that family organization of who's going to have access to resources, who is in line to inherit resources, and who gets to make those decisions. So this is a very, very hierarchical system in which everybody knows their position within that family, and there's a very distinct rank system that goes into it. Omaha, and within this culture, we see a very patriarchal system. So, in a similar way to Hawaiian, say uh, your father is going to have brothers and sisters. Um, his brothers and sisters will have more particular influence in the family. So, like father or your uncle on your dad's side will have sort of the same position as your father, will have those same rights and responsibilities. And his sister is going to have a lot of those rights and responsibilities as well, but certainly no one that isn't blood related. Um, within the on the female side, you are again going to have um, sort of mother responsibilities. So your aunts, but any of your uncles on your mother's side have zero say in what goes on within that direct family lineage. So, um, anyone that has been married into the system, and you are usually following that patriarchal line. So there's more um, rights and responsibilities along that line. Uh, in Crow culture, we see the opposite, right? Again, you're going to have very similar aspects of how families are organized. Um, again, you're on your mother's side, you're going to see the same thing. Her sisters are going to be considered mothers, but her brother is going to be like mother's brother, but not seen as a father figure, and vice versa on the father's side. Um, you're still going to have like on your mother's side, if your aunt has kids, they're going to be considered your brothers and sisters. If your mother's brother has kids, they become cousins. Okay, so they don't have the same rights and responsibilities. So it changes the dynamics a little bit. Um, so again, right, your aunt who is considered your mom has kids. Those kids become like brothers and sisters. They are considered to be the same part of that family and that organization. The Iroquois have a system in which um, they're both matrilineal and patrilineal. So but they focus on shared generational roles. So again, going back to that system of on your father's side, you would have uh, your his brothers are going to have kids. They're going to be considered your brothers and sisters. If your father's sister has kids, they become cousins, right? And the same way on the mother's side, right? If your mom's sister has kids, she is considered to be your mother. Her kids are going to be your brother and sister. On your mom side, again, if she has a brother, he becomes uncle, right? And his kids become cousins. And so, right, organizing those allows us to help understand how those cultural systems, how resources are shared, the importance of particular members of the family, how connected they are, how that power system is shared. Okay, we're going to stop there, and then we'll continue on in a moment. to sort of get you caught up on the next part. All right, we'll see you in a few.